This is a paper that I'm working on with Randy Cohen, and it's a style of economics that I think boils down to, hey, look at this, right? It's sort of an interesting fact, a couple of facts that we think are useful to know about and that we want to share with you. It's a very simple set of things that I want you to walk away from this talk understanding. We've been thinking about municipal bonds since about 2007, and it's really interesting to be at this conference, which I think is incredibly useful because you're taking work from different areas and you're kind of putting them, in a spotlight that is placed against other phenomena that are very likely related. But if you're kind of working in the municipal world, you may not be necessarily as attentive on a minute-to-minute basis with respect to how the phenomena that we're looking at relate to or compare with or maybe interact with other phenomena. And so I would say in 2007, when you talk about municipal bonds, you'd say the market is very large, it's very important. You have $3 trillion worth of municipal debt in terms of the bond, qua bond amount of borrowing. That compares to, say, $8 trillion in federal debt, right? And every time sort of muni people get up to talk about how important municipal bond market is relative to, it's a big part of how in the federal system, a big chunk of the borrowing is at the state and local level. And I am astounded by the growth of the federal debt. Like as I sort of look at the most recent papers the papers we just saw discussed, muni bond market is incredibly important. It's a $4 trillion market. We think that it's worthy of study for a lot of reasons. In particular, if you came to this conference, you used infrastructure that was financed by this market. Like if you fly in an airport, if you travel on a road, if you're at a university, like all the things that we rely on governments to do, those things the infrastructure is financed by the muni market. At the same time, it's impossible not to acknowledge that like the federal debt is now $37 trillion. And so, in the old days, you'd say, hey, here's munis. It's order of magnitude, kind of in the same order of magnitude as federal borrowing. And the explosive growth of the federal debt is staggering. What we're doing in this paper, right, is here's sort of my introduction to this market. The things that make it interesting to study, the thing that make it important is that what we think of as kind of the American way of life, right, is financed by the operation of this market to a disproportionate degree. The market is very diverse. You have about 60,000 different issuers. It is disproportionately a market where direct household investment is important. In the treasury market, it's one issuer selling mostly to institutions. In the muni market, it's 60,000 issuers selling disproportionately to individual households. And the default rates are very low relative to, historically, this has been a market where the default rates are low relative to the corporate bond market. So for the population of rated debt, extremely low, the number is there. There was the folks at the New York Fed did a study recently, maybe not recently, but a while back, showing that actually if you look at unrated bonds in the muni universe, you have sort of higher default rates. If something is like literally garbage, like that stuff actually does kind of default sometimes, but in the rated part of the market, default rates are quite low. Now, why this paper? We view the credit quality and also the tax exemption of the municipal, the tax exempt debt as being to some degree the outcome of a political process. And in a political process, the distribution of how that debt is held will matter, right? And so we first started thinking about this in the aftermath of the Detroit bankruptcy. So the Detroit bankruptcy in 2013 was a bit of I think it was a surprise to me that general obligation bondholders took as much of a hit as they did. And This was also happening at the same time that Greece was having trouble. And I will get in trouble with my my 3-sentence description of Greece versus Japan, right? So Greece gets to a debt to GDP ratio of 150%, and they default, right? Japan runs at a debt to GDP ratio of, say, 700, whatever it is, 250%, and they haven't defaulted yet, right? And what is a difference? Well, the Greek folks borrowed from the Germans, right? And the Japanese borrowed from the Japanese. And so if you view the repayment, like doing the things that are required to repay the debt as being an outcome of a political process, the Greeks kind of collectively got together and said, do we like the Germans? And the Japanese kind of get together, every time they vote, they get together. And the question is like, do we like Japan? And the answer just is yes. And so as we are thinking about what we're seeing in the distribution of ownership of municipal debt, because making the decisions that you have to make in order for that to get repaid, and also it's a different question. It was something that we were less focused on then, we're more focused on now, but it's the tax exemption. Those are the outcomes of political processes. So here's what we saw sort of the first time we started thinking about this, and I'll say it remains true. So here we're looking at the surveys of consumer finances from 1989 to 2022. It's every 3 years the Federal Reserve does this survey, and the punchline, if you kind of walk out of the room, say, what did Bergstresser tell us? If you look at the share of households that report in the SCF owning any municipal debt, in the period between 1988 and say 2001, it was running at 4.5% to 5%, and now it's just over 2%. So it's gone down by about half, right? And what we're saying, like with our model of political economy that is behind thinking that this matters, is very much like a 11 is larger than 9 style of model. Like that is sort of the style of model that we have in mind. But this is, given that in the background, it's political decisions that matter for credit quality. This has a chance of being something that will matter. If you look at the share that is held by the very rich folks versus the bottom 90%, the bottom 90% is kind of bouncing around, but the share that is held by the we can call them the extremely fortunate has gone from about 23% to over 50%. And you might say, well, haven't the rich gotten richer in general? What's happened in the muni universe is much greater. Like this concentration of ownership at the very top is larger in munis than it is in other asset classes. And in fact, other asset classes, you're seeing exactly how you describe, like whether you call something concentrated or not concentrated depends to some degree on exactly how you measure it. But you see a lot more households over this time that report holding any equity at all, right? So even though the rich are in some sense getting richer, the penetration of tax-deferred investing has expanded the set of households who report holding any equity. And so what's happening in the muni world is quite different. So this is the punchline. If you look at the share held by the very rich, it's gone from less than a quarter to over half over kind of a generation. If you compare that, for example, let's say look at the share of households that own any equity, right? So this is accounting heads, this is accounting dollars, but we do both for both assets. The share of households reporting any equity is going up over time. And I want to put this project in context relative to other work that people are doing that is, we think, very important, and also it's important to distinguish. So the folks at Chicago's Center for Municipal Finance have been investigating, we're looking at wealth concentration. And the punchline is munis are now held no longer by the dentists of the world, like the kind of 90 to 95 percentiles, but they're held by the really rich folks. Justin is looking at concentration spatially, right? So this is what he's doing. He I think, is thinking more about the political calculus behind the tax exemption. So he's started to produce data that shows congressional district by congressional district, the concentration of municipal interest by congressional interest district, to say, as you think about the tax exemption, this is where the tax exempt interest is going. The other paper in this panel, which Christian is going to present, is looking at kind of a different notion of spatial concentration, which I would, like, Christian may disagree, but I would say, like, my summary of why that's important is a world where Kentucky households work for Kentucky companies and their portfolios are invested in Kentucky bonds has some risk concentration that we want to think about as well. And that's a totally different notion of concentration from what we're talking about, but it's also equally important. And there is some tension between these, right? If I'm gonna buy Kentucky bonds, right, I want the people who are voting to repay those bonds, like whose voting will determine whether those bonds get repaid or not, to suffer if they don't pay the bonds back. So I actually, as an investor, I want a little bit of concentrated, as an outside investor, I'm a little wary about not punishing people. But I think there are competing objectives here. There's also, you can now get from the Federal Reserve what's called the distributional financial accounts, which is basically taking the triennial surveys of consumer finance and running those portfolio by where you are in the wealth distribution shares of assets, and then using higher frequency data on the evolution of the value of different asset classes to get high frequency or higher frequency assessments of what changing market conditions mean across the wealth distribution. So these are all related but distinguishable. Okay, and so big picture, sort of I'll go to, this is not an audience, I think, where I would need to describe a lot about the survey of consumer finances, except I will say one thing about what keeps me up at night about this project. Like, I think this is a very, very simple, this is like look here econometrics, right? The SCF does have to do imputation for non-response. Right, so you knock on doors, you get a letter from the chairman that says, hey, we need you to respond to the survey, like America will collapse if you don't respond. And they get a very, very high response rate. But it is the case that sort of asset class by asset class, the willingness to share the size of the holdings of different asset classes varies. And something like 20% of people who own municipal bonds, who report owning municipal bonds, also refused to say how much they owned. I don't know if there's something particularly paranoid about owners of municipal debt. And what the survey does, which I think is scientifically justifiable, is a multiple imputation process where they sort of use evidence from other observations and they sort of impute the missing data. But the thing that I would say, we're all friends here, and so I would say, what kind of keeps me up at night about anything that is based on something that is imputed, there are some observations here, 20% of the observations, the holdings of municipal debt are being imputed. Okay. Presenters, the clock, I've been following the clock, and then it reset. I don't know if... I don't know if there's like I've always wondered about this. When people are giving a talk, if people will quietly run the counter down. It's like, well, all right, let's hurry this up. Okay, I'm basically done, but I'll say the points we make here. Munis are held directly. Asset concentration has increased over time, but what's happened in the muni world has been very, very large relative to other asset classes. Then, if you go wave by wave through the survey, and you fit a model, very simple model, just predicting, do you own munis on independent variables? The only really consistent predictor of whether or not you own municipal bonds is the share of your wealth that's held in tax-deferred accounts. Right? So if your wealth is held in tax-deferred accounts, you're much less likely to own munis. Like controlling for everything else. That's the big change. And this time period has also seen, if you think about how the dentists of the world now invest, in 1989 it was less true. Now it's very true that for the mass affluent investors, the important locus of investing has become tax-deferred accounts. And munis are not an asset class that you'd want to put in there. So in one picture, this, what we suspect, but really can't, I say we can't prove this. And I can imagine somebody coming up with a model where they would say, actually, it's not whether or not you own municipal bonds. It's like how much you own that matters. And in fact, the political power of the top 5% is going up. So in fact, having the wealth concentrated in that top 5% actually makes more munis more safe because Elon Musk tells everybody what to do anyways. And we say that is a more complicated model than what we have in mind, which is basically 5 is larger than 2. All right. So that's it. I appreciate the opportunity to share this research with you.